So how's everyone doing? Good. How's the meal? Excellent. Do we have, if you brought something, would you just stand up? We just want to say thank you. And then Kathy's out there as well. Make sure you thank her when you see her. She'll come in as well. And before I forget, because I forgot the first week, here are sign-ups for next week's food. You don't have to, no pressure, but I'll just pass them around and they can make their way. So I want to start off for just the sake of review. We have some people who have not been. Speaking of which, would you mind introducing your nephew? Would you do that for me? If that's okay. Do you feel comfortable? Here. Microphones are wonderful because it goes to the recording.
This is John Brady. And he's my sister Pat's only son. And my favorite nephew.
Awesome. Hey, John, it's great meeting you. Thanks for coming. So we're going to start with conversation partially for the sake of us reviewing, but also it helps us to talk about what's kind of been resonating with the last couple weeks. So I actually want to start with that question. If you're willing to share, what has resonated with you over the last few weeks? Here you go. Yeah, sorry. Everyone who's not here who will be watching the video will be thankful.
Well, I think that most of us are on the same page about we're needing to fire up and get some more people to start coming on a regular basis, but that we love being here and we love each other.
Excellent. Teddy, you go ahead.
The thing that struck me is what was happening to the Israelites as they came.
Yeah.
On their journey. And there were two things about that I could see. One was they often didn't think God could do it. Water and the food. And then when he did, they didn't have thankful hearts. So it seemed like there were two things that maybe we could learn from that.
Excellent. Anybody else? What's been resonating with you? What maybe has caught you off guard? You're like, ooh, I've had to think about that. There you go. I'm going to turn it up a little.
So the little kind of homework assignment we had about what is your preference, what is non-negotiable, and that I really had to think about some of those things. And I wanted another column, one that was like a preference, heavy on the preference, but kind of non-negotiable. So it got me to thinking a lot about what do I need as a core in the church I go to. So.
Excellent. So if you weren't here, we didn't have a lot of time to talk through it, unfortunately. So if you have any questions around it, you could ask me after. But I talked through categorizing the things that when you come here and you're like, I'm so glad we have that, or I love that, or you visit another church and it's something that you love about how we worship, how we do fellowship, how we do outreach. I had you categorize them based on, is this something that maybe I'm worshiping unhealthily? Is this a preference? Or is this a non-negotiable? And then be able to articulate, if it's a non-negotiable, why is it a non-negotiable? So, awesome. Anybody else? Here you go.
In my non-negotiable, or things that we already do very well. And one is that we take the Eucharist, serve the Eucharist, and receive it every week.
Yep.
That's pretty important to me. Also, that we regularly read the lectionary scriptures.
Yep.
And maybe even have teachings on that. One other thing that is non-negotiable to me, and this is really sticking my neck out, is that we learn, if we need to learn, but we at least sing the hymns of the church. And they would be led by piano, organ, or choir.
Okay. Awesome. One or two others? No takers. Awesome. I got more questions, so I'll move us on because this is fun. All right, this is what I want you to do is turn to 2, 3, maybe 4 people next to you and say, in the course of your lifetime, how have you seen society change? You can list whatever you want to. I'll maybe ask for each group, maybe no more than 2. But I will let's give 4 minutes for this. Yeah, turn next to you, list as many as you can. Perfect. All right. A couple people, couple groups maybe want to share. Maybe just 1 or 2 things each. Oh, we got Teddy. Maybe just a few of them. Here you go.
The morality of society. Not everything. Lots of things are about me. Christ was taken out of society that is being taken, and technology, our attitudes, and the disregard for the human being, the body, the spirit.
Excellent. Maybe a few more. Yeah.
We said marriage and divorce, a complete disrespect for authority. We no longer hold Sunday as being a sacred day. Stores are open. A lack of manners.
So maybe one more group. Somebody over here, maybe? We're appointing someone.
I've been told.
We're all in agreement on
Okay.
Well, kind of like what Teddy said, that God is no longer a non-negotiable. And that we're a very mobile society. We don't stay in our hometown and raise our children and grandchildren, all that. They move all over the place. And there was something else.
Lack of personal communication has been taken away by this.
So, yeah, share it in the mic just so it makes a recording. For
What
us.
I
That'd be awesome.
talked about was the lack of personal communication, spoken words, eye connection, of looking at someone and seeing their emotions. Body language, voice has been replaced by text messaging, I guess the thing closest to that would be the Skyping to where people can actually see each other on the messages, but you see too much of, and one of our groups said one of their biggest pet peeves was if somebody was feeding their baby in one hand and then texting in the other.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so what's more important there?
Excellent. So we got some here.
Skyping is good. Texting is good. But human contact is more important than anything.
Yeah.
This man drove all the way from Seattle to see his Aunt Alice.
It's fantastic.
And nothing beats that.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, that beats a text. Hey, how you doing? You know, that's fantastic. So, yeah.
I'm an old board gamer. I love board games. I invent board games. The idea behind doing a video game, it's great. You can just shut it off, turn it back on. You're kind of in the same place. The thing about board games is simple. Board games have rules, right? Everybody has board. Okay, you know what rules are? suggested guidelines of play. You can change them however you want, and you're interacting with all your friends around you, whether it's a pinochle game or it's a game of Risk or Sorry or Jenga or whatever. But you're interacting with people. People is where the power is.
That's really good. I even, in that, I would say, Larry's got one. I would say game nights and family nights and dinner as families is something that, used to be a regular non-negotiable in a lot of households, and that's changed a lot. So, yeah, Larry?
I thought it was interesting that your question is just change. All of the things that have been mentioned are perceived deteriorations. So apparently there hasn't been any progress. Now, the first thing I thought of in our little group was that when the year we were married was the year Martin Luther King gave his famous speech on the Washington Mall. And I think of the racism that institutionalized at that point and the fact that it's being attacked, and it is limited now, but it still exists. Mm-hmm. But there is such a change. In the 60s, Bill Cosby made news when he was a star on I Spy.
Yeah. That
couldn't happen anymore. So there is some things, although I think we always say that the good things can be misused. That's one of my slogans too. Every good thing is going to be misused, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a good use for it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask a question that has to do with, you could keep the microphone and pass it around if needed. So here's the deal. Both today and next week could be 2 weeks on its own. And so as I was moving stuff around, just forgive me. I realize I miss a couple commas in some spaces and miss a couple suffixes and prefixes in some places because I was literally just trying to determine what. So anyway, just know that I'm aware that this has a typo. But here's the question. In what ways have these changes affected Christian culture for positively, or in a positive way or negatively? Just reword that question so it makes sense. But in what ways has these changes affected Christianity, so how we live out our faith, how Christianity is in our society, in either a positive or a negative way? All right, Tom, who's got the mic?
Back in my year, you didn't have organized sports.
We didn't have organized what?
We did not have organized social sports.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Today, the church is being taken a beating because of the soccer games, the football games, and the baseball games all on Sunday.
Yeah.
We never had those before. So it not only takes the child away from the church, it takes the family away from the church.
Yep.
So some of that deterioration, you can see it in the kids. You can see it in the kids. Even in the ball fields. I raised my kids on Bill Passy and the soccer leagues. And the foul-mouthed kids now, it's incredible.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Maybe one or two more? Right behind you.
Sunday was a day to go to church. Almost everybody went to church. There were always some where the father stayed home and didn't go, but Sunday was a day to go to church. Sunday was not a day to go to a store. You went to church. Sometimes you went back again at night. You had people over for dinner. You fellowshiped. We lost that, I think.
Yeah. One more. Gail? Here you go.
On the positive side, we were talking about the fact that the Wright brothers and their 12-second flight changed the world forever. And I think today of my son, who is in a different country every other week, training people to go out and make disciples of other people within the country. And so it's empowered him to be able to do this. I mean, he could be in Australia one week and Africa the next, one of the countries in Africa. So I think of he and his wife, he married a gal from Chile, and he's from Colorado Springs. They met in South Korea at a Christian conference. So, that's one of the positives that I think we can take out of it is it's empowered more. Well, we've got Corey and her family that, without the transportation, they would not be able to be in Europe doing their work for God. So,
Excellent. Excellent. Let me add one, and that's technology. Yeah, that's actually where I'm going. Yeah. So technology, it could be abused, and it's a lot of the reason why we have communication issues. However, without the television, Billy Graham would not have been able to get the message of the gospel to as many people as he did. And now we have, like I said last week, that my phone up there is broadcasting live tonight. I mean, it's live. Anybody could tune into it. It's a computer that's more powerful than what they put people on the moon with. And now we could live out that, what does a hymn say? Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing, my great. Like literally share, like, comment, share. Allows us to engage the message of the gospel with good content as we do good content right in front of people's faces as it comes through feeds. So there is positivity with technology. It could be abused, but I want to add that. I want to make a couple statements tonight. And tonight's the night where I engage with this word, post-Christian. And for many, over the last couple weeks, I've heard this. This has been some of the first time in which maybe you've heard this word, heard this term, had to interact with this word. And I want to encourage you that, and I'm going to dig into it, it's not as scary as it sounds. It's not as scary as it sounds. And actually, we might have some fear in us around what this might mean. Next week, we're going to dig into the practicality then of living out our mission as the church. And you'll actually find that a lot of the tension will ease. And here's what you're going to find next week. Because of the fact that we're rooted in a historical practice, you're going to find that actually we're ahead of the curve in some ways. And some people don't know it yet. And so that's actually a positive thing. And we're gonna talk a little bit about that next week. But today I want to ask you to just kind of be willing to say, okay, I'm willing to listen and engage with what's being said here. And I'm going to say this a bunch tonight. Jesus is on the throne, and it's his kingdom that will last forever. It's not dependent on where culture is. Culture has been in and out, and empires have risen and fall, and this, that, and the other. Scripture is a promise to David in the Davidic covenant. His kingdom will last forever. We see that again in Isaiah. I'm going to talk a little bit about Isaiah tonight. So tonight, I'm going to dig a little bit into history. I'm going to dig a little bit into the Bible, and through that, we'll pepper more discussion like what we had so far. So here's what I want to say. Man, I put a question mark on here. I don't know why. So you know what? I'm just going to stay here. The entire Bible was written in a pre-Christian world. Think about that. The entire Bible was written in a pre-Christian world. You catch what I'm saying? Even up to the point, most likely John the Apostle was the longest apostle to live and was writing, 30 years after the other guys. He's in persecution because of his faith, because they're seen as some weird atheistic cult, right? And the gospel still blew up. So the entire Bible was written in a pre-Christian world. Here's the other thing that's really cool. Do you know why we are so drawn to Paul and Paul's writings? Yep. That's right. I think there's a lot that when we read Paul, because of what our culture is currently, and because of who he was, it draws us to his message. And so I want us to frame and understand that we can receive the good news, we can hear the good news, and the good news stands and explodes no matter where culture is. Are you tracking with me? Do you agree with me? Excellent. So I want us to understand the entire Bible was written in a pre-Christian world. Here is where I also want to go, is that doctrine and the definition of Orthodox Christianity, all that stuff was formed in like the first 400 years AD, where really, what is it, like 77 of the last years of that 400 years, Christianity was actually the official religion. So think about that. Think about that. That means that as the apostles are spreading the gospel, they're writing their letters, it's all under persecution. They literally are seen as a weird, like, atheistic cult. And they were seen as an atheistic cult because they refused to declare Caesar as Lord or say that there's divinity there. And so under this persecution, under a world that didn't get their values, under a world that persecuted them, the gospel blew up. Then we see that all these writings and letters and works over the next 200 years, still Christianity is not an official religion. They start coming together, copies start being compiled, and they start to stand on which one of these works are authoritative or not. Then, does anybody know what happened at 313 AD? Almost. Nicaea's 325. 313. Do what? Yep, Constantine, the Edict of Milan. And what the Edict of Milan did was it made Christianity the official religion. So all of a sudden, all these people that were in prison, including St. Nicholas, by the way, they all of a sudden get released from prison because they're no longer worshiping in illegal ways. And so Constantine, like, he doesn't really care where they land on some things. He just wants them to land on some things. And there's these differing opinions between a guy by the name of Arius and then these guys that hold what we call Trinitarian views. And they get together at the Council of Nicaea, 325, and they work out, and they about, what is it? It's 381 was when they had the second, finalization. They work out the Nicene Creed, the doctrine of the Trinity, and everything kind of that they root themselves in is this is the line of Orthodox Christianity. But 300 and some years leading up to that point, when Christianity was not an official religion, they were already working it out and the Holy Spirit was moving them. So that when they came to like 389, that's when they started to canonize and finalize Scripture. But they had already had those authoritative letters kind of worked out between themselves, except for a few. But I want us to understand that all that stuff happened with the world not being a Christian world. And so what that does is that gives us hope that no matter where culture goes, the gospel stands, Jesus is on the throne, the Holy Spirit's moving it forward, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church, right? Right. So we see this progression, and we have pre-Christianity. See if that's... Let me use this term minority, actually. I want to go back a slide. Through history, the church grows at a rapid pace in places where followers of Jesus are the persecuted minority. I want to use that word minority because it's very important. Right now, there's a guy by the name of John Tyson. He's out of New York. He wrote a book called The Creative Minority, helping Christians understand what it means now to live as the minority. But here's the deal. Where in Anglicanism, where is it the most prominent? We're the third largest Christian movement in the world. Where is it most prominent? Africa, Asia, and some in South America. Yep. It's because of a persecuted minority. And I want us to think about that as we think about hope for Jesus and hope for the gospel to the world. So we see this movement, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, and I'm going to zoom in here in a little while to talk about how are we doing on time? About here in a little while. I'll get to where I talk through most in a lot of our lifetime, some of the changes we saw that has led us to this. But we've seen pre-Christianity, we've seen Christianity be the dominant movement in the West for 1,500 some years. And then, because of the Age of Enlightenment, because of modernity, and then something called post-modernity coming in the 1900s, we suddenly see this shift into what we would call post-Christianity. And here's what post-Christianity is. Here's a definition if you want to kind of understand. Post-Christianity is the loss of the primacy of Christian worldview in the life and political affairs, especially in the Western world where Christianity had previously flourished in favor of an alternative worldview such as secularism or nationalism. And so one of the things that we see, I lived in the Bay Area for 5 years. One of the things we see, and I'll point towards secularism, there's a lot of people that are like, look, I'm not like against the faith. I'm not against Christianity. I'm not against the idea of God. I just have a great job. My family's good. I got a great house, a great car. Why do I need it? And that's more the dominant idea that's trickling in. Why do I need it? And I'm going to talk a little bit. There's a phrase that I'm going to use today twice that then we're going to come back to next week. Push us on here. One of the continual themes through redemptive history is this: promised land to exile. So you have the created in the garden is theirs to tend. They have all, Adam and Eve have they just don't eat of the tree. But because of their disobedience, because of their sin, because of their idolatry, because of all these things, they're exiled and sent east. So right away in the first book of the Bible, we see them move from promised land to exile. And I want us to kind of use some of that language for us to understand, even in Christianity, we could see this move from either exile to promised land and maybe back to exile as it pertains to how the culture accepts us. And we see Isaiah and Jeremiah. Those are kind of the two big ones. I mean, there's a ton of prophets, but these are the two that we see that are clear that they're doing prophetic work before the exile into Babylon, and then they're doing prophetic work after the exile into Babylon. And Babylon, I'm going to play a video here in a minute. Babylon is a place that holds values that are completely and totally contrary to the same values, the same commands that God gave his people. Here's where I want us to sit, and because I know that this can be scary for some to dig into this, and because we're like, oh man, does that mean that Jesus is not on the throne anymore? I want to actually pull us into one thing that Isaiah says. Isaiah 6, we may have heard this before. And this is before he starts writing about a lot of the exilic stuff. But Isaiah 6, this is where it starts. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne. I want to pause here. Here's what's happening. King Uzziah was a really good king. He was a good king. Here's what Isaiah is saying. In a time where things were good and then went really bad, everybody was fearful. Everybody was fearful. I saw the Lord seated on the throne, high and exalted. It's this reminder that even in times in our world where stuff goes wrong and we're like, I don't know how this is going to work, and I don't know what this means for how I practice my faith or what it means for my kids 20 years from now because of decisions that they're making in our state or this, that, and the other, we could say, but the Lord's on the throne. He's high and exalted. And then it goes into this pattern that actually most Christian liturgy is patterned after. And it says, the robe is filled with the temple. Above him were the seraphim. That's a whole nother conversation, which I don't have time for, but that's fun. Each with 6 wings. With 2 wings, they covered their faces, and with 2, they covered their feet, and the 2, they were flying. And they were calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth was filled with his glory." Now think about our Eucharistic practice as I read this. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried, because he saw the glory of the Lord. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips." So there's a moment here of confession, right? "I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth. What do we take? What do we receive before we leave? The Eucharist. "See, this has touched my lips. Your guilt has been taken away, and your sin is atoned for." Then I heard the voice saying, "Whom shall I send? And whom shall go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me," as we say that we go forth into the world. So what this tells us first and foremost is that in a time where things are crazy, when King Uzziah dies, the Lord is seated on the throne. And then what it does, it's a call to worship. It's a moment of worship that he sees in this vision that we actually pattern for 2,000 years our liturgy after. Think about how important it is that we worship. How are we doing on time? Okay, I want to give us 5 minutes. If you took my last class, we interacted with some of these passages before. But would someone take 1 Peter 2, 9 through 16? Is somebody willing to take that and maybe group around it? We have Al. Al's willing to take that. And if a couple others, is somebody willing to take Genesis 41, 46 through 57? Gordon. And then somebody willing to take Jeremiah 29, 1 through 7? You know what, let's do this just for the sake of time. Would you be willing to, Al, just to read it out loud? We'll just interact with it out loud. There you go. Would you read it out loud? Oh, sorry. Is it on? Give it 2 seconds after you turn. Oh, good.
But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, so that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light.
Is that 1 Peter 2, 9 through 16?
1 Peter 2, 9.
Awesome. So what is that calling God's people to do? And think this is a pre-Christian under persecution world. Oh, sorry. I don't have it in front of me up there.
Okay. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received the mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sin, desire which wages war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on a day he visits us. Submit yourself to the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the empire or the superior authority. or to the governors, who has set by him to publish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence their ignorance talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil, like as God's slaves. Live as God's slaves.
Excellent. So I want to point out a few things. It says you're exiles and foreigners. This is a time, and if you look at 1 Peter and continue through, it actually talks about hope in times of persecution. So if we see that we are foreigners and exiles, or that, what are some of the commands there that it gives? What does it say? Submit yourself to what? Yep. So participate in what's happening in society. Submit yourself to it. Live within it. Genesis 41, 46 through 57. Gordon's got that one?
Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the field surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph had said, there was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world.
Awesome. So Joseph is in the line of who we see becomes the Israelites, and he's put into slavery in this foreign empire, and he winds up moving up in rank and winds up putting so much into it that not only is he able to bless his land, he's able to bless other people's land as well. Jeremiah 29, 1 through 7, who has that? And after you read it, hold it open because I'm going to ask you one more question after.
This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiakim and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elisha, son of Shaphan, and to Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, whom Jedediah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper.
Awesome. Keep it open because I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. Well, you could keep the mic. Picture this. They're moving from the promised land into exile in Babylon. And in a minute, I'm going to play a little bit of a video so we understand Babylon a little bit and why this is relevant for us. But think about how much of us we might feel that we once in America, mid-century, from the time it was founded till out, the 80s when these conversations started popping, that we were in the promised land. And then all of a sudden something happened. But there's a command here: seek the welfare of your city. Put your roots down, multiply, don't decrease. Go ahead and read verse 11 for me. We just set up the context. Read verse 11. You all recognize this.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future.
Excellent. So when we hear that out of context, sometimes we think, oh, we're marching to the promised land. But if we understand the context of that verse that we all love is actually as they're marching into exile, it gives us hope. And here's the beauty. As they're leaving the temple, Jeremiah is clear on this if you read it. They're leaving the temple, the place where God dwelled, and they worship him. The presence of God actually goes with them. And there's hope in that. I want to play you a quick video for us to kind of talk about this concept. Let me hit play and then I will shut off lights.
In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now, some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy? That would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust, take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect, but instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So, for example?
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
They won't go that far.
Right. This is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes. In fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, But now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or does it? In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.
All right, I want to pause here. Move us forward. Do you have the microphone? Oh, no, we got it up here. So this concept of moving promised land to exile and this idea of seeking the welfare for our land, but kind of changing our perspective of the land we live in. I know there's a lot, maybe you've never heard this, maybe you've never considered this, but I'm curious, the relevance for today, some of the stuff we talked about and the shifts of our culture at the beginning, how it's affected Christianity. What are some of the things that are going through your mind as you see that, as you've read some of the passages? I just want to pause here and just kind of talk out loud if anybody has anything.
It seems that we need to be a melting pot. Not that we're going to go along with everything that's in our society, but to take and be like the ones that were exiled. They still kept their loyalty to God and brought that with them and held on to it and lived it. And as we're asked to do the same thing.
Awesome. Hold that thought because I'm going to ask how in a minute. Maybe one more? Somebody else? Mary?
This isn't new.
Excellent.
It's been going on since the beginning.
Yep, that pattern of promised land exile. Last one. Here.
I kind of gathered we're not supposed to be pouters. We're supposed to really live and love and thrive and do all that that others might see that and give glory to God.
Awesome. Real quick, with that, I wanna read. This is Mark Laberton. He's the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, if you've heard of that institution. He wrote this book called Called. It was a freebie. I went to go talk to them about possibly doing a master's in theology there. And they just give away free things trying to get you hooked. And I tossed it in a bag, and I was on a retreat. I was like, sure, I'll take it. I was blown away by how good it is. But it says this, it talks about blaming the world for its lack of salt and light. That's not their job. And there's so much in here. If ever you want to pick this up, it's called Called, but it helps us understand what are we called to, and we're called in the land and the context that we're in. And sometimes that shifts. But here's where I want to go with this before I close us out. I asked how, because yes, we seek the welfare. We're called in the context we are in. And the context that we are in has moved away from Christian values, at least in the way in which it was lived out before. We'll say that. Whether you agree with that statement or not, at least in the way it was lived out before. Here's how we keep our identity as God's people. It's through worship. As a musician, I always joke that Sunday morning is the accent. If you know what an accent is, it helps you find the downbeat. It's the accent of the rhythm of our week in our life. We're reminded who we are and who God is as we worship. I don't have time to play the video. I have another video similar to the last one, but the book of Psalms was actually purposed for this. The book of Psalms was actually compiled in exile and was used both in exile and in the Second Temple period so that they would have language to pray and language to worship. It was their book of common prayer. And I'll get a little bit more into this next week, but this is why it is important that as we worship to timeless songs, we worship to timeless prayers, we worship to these things that have stood the test of time and shape us and continue to form us into our identity as God's people. So I'm just gonna sit on there, but that's very important of the how do we keep our identity in our world.
We've been talking about.
So I want to show you this. Some of you have seen this before if you've taken one of my last classes. But this is religious diversity in the 1950s. So you have Presbyterian there, you have an Episcopalian there, you have a Methodist there, a Catholic there, a Baptist there. Here's what religious diversity looks like now. Buddhists, agnostics are like, well, there could be a God. I don't know. It doesn't really affect me. Maybe someday I'll get it figured out. Atheists, Christians, they're all just kind of lumped together and we're the minority. Wiccans, those are witchcraft. And I'd maybe put New Age beliefs in that as well. So we've shifted now from a Christian world that's diverse within Christianity to a world that is diverse. I'm going to move us forward on some of this as well. Many of you are aware of some of what I'm going to talk about. You lived through it. But after the Second World War, many people hunkered down, and it's like all this morale was happening. We're like, man, we're going to seek the welfare of our world. There was a lot of morale happening, right? And so people started moving to the suburbs and to towns. Their baby boom happened. Everybody's going to church. And here's what you found about Christianity and church. Christianity, including going to church, was seen as beneficial for individuals in society. This is a key point for us to understand. This is a key point for us to understand because there's a huge shift from this mentality in two ways that I'm going to explain in a minute. Then the 60s hit. I love the Beatles, but the 60s hit. It's a reality. It changed our culture completely. Out of the 60s, we had a revival movement here. And the Jesus movement, do you all know about the Jesus movement? Is all the hippies that all came to know Christ. And it happened primarily here in California. They're getting dunked and baptized. But here's what came out of the hippie movement, is a Christian subculture. So now they're going to keep their rock and roll, but they're going to have a Christian version of it. And so they're going to keep their whatever, goods and services, but they're going to have a Christian version of it. So you get a Christian subculture popping up, and I'm one of the people that was raised by the kids who were, I'm a kid of that movement. I grew up in Colorado Springs, was like the mecca of the Christian subculture. So I grew up with Focus on the Family, Adventures in Odyssey. I went to school with characters from Adventures in Odyssey, people that put out voice, drama, acting. It's interesting, a lot of them are atheists now. A lot of them aren't involved in church, a lot of them. But I grew up as a kid that was involved in the Christian subculture, that was a kid of the Jesus movement. And then what we see later on starting to pop up, and I'm moving quicker through things, but we started seeing this language. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. How many of you have seen that? I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. That popped up around the 90s. And then 2000s, it started affecting the way a lot of churches kind of started to do church ministry and outreach. And so they started being like, well, let's hop onto this. Let's make things more experiential. And what wound up happening is we started seeing what I call syncretism. So what it means is all these different belief systems synchronizing. And I liken it to like a Chili's or Applebee's platter. Like everybody just like picks their spiritual religious thing, and at the end you get to like taste them all together. But that's how people practiced their spirituality. It was this mixture of all of these belief systems, and it was stepping away. And many of you, I know because of the movement out of St. Paul's, many of you experienced a lot of these conversations, right? They were relevant in that time. Since then, there's been a lot of podcasts now that are dealing with a lot of these conversations of people my generation who are like, I was raised in church, I can't talk to anybody about my struggle with faith. And so people are going to podcasts. These are some of my friends. That's Michael Gunger. Him and his wife actually, when James was born, they did the baby shower for James, so that's him on the far left. He wrote the song Beautiful Things. Do you know that song? You make beautiful things out of the dust. William Matthews, he's from Bethel up in Redding and no longer works there. And then you have Mike McHargue there. He's a scientist who was an atheist but didn't tell anybody. He worked at a Southern Baptist church and then came out as an atheist. And he wrote a book about his process into believing in God again. Here's the deal, though. We're finding a lot of people who were raised in the time I was raised, the Focus on the Family time period and that. They're not going to their churches looking for answers. They're going to podcasts. The problem is I wouldn't trust these. I literally, I can't, I would never tell anybody, hey, you want to figure out what you believe? Go to a podcast. I believe that the local church is the hope. But yet we see they have over 1 million downloads and 250,000 subscribers of people that were mostly raised in church that don't know what they believe and they're trying to figure it out. And it's at times it's cool and at times it's kind of dangerous. And so I think that the church is and needs to be an answer to part of that problem. I'll continue on. The language shifted. It used to be, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. Now it's shifted to, I'm not spiritual, I'm religious. And here's why. People don't want to believe in any sort of divine being, but they believe that there's habits in their life that they can keep and hold to that better them. This is Derek Webb. He's an atheist now. He's the guy who wrote God of Wonders. You know the song, God of Wonders beyond our galaxy. Did you guys ever do that? Well, that's him, Caedmon's Call. He was really big, 90s, 2000s, and that's one of the statements that he makes continually. I'm not spiritual, I'm religious. And he has a daily regiment and a weekly regiment that he holds. A couple things. We right now have a generation, the largest in the workforce, the millennials, that 59% of them that were raised in church leave the church and currently have no desire to return. And a lot of them are listening to podcasts, seeking answers elsewhere, their phones, Googling stuff. And I think the church is the answer and needs to be the hope. I honestly do. That's my belief. That's why I am heavily participating in church. I believe that. Here's something that's really interesting, and then I'll end on one point. So traditionally, when Christianity was kind of the dominant thing in America, traditionally we would say 80% of America claims Christianity. But what we're seeing, and that's actually a very it says 17% of that stat, of that 80%. I've read new polls that actually say 11% of that 80% actually lives life through the lens of a biblical worldview. And they line that up by 8 criteria. I don't have time to read it all, but it's things like the virgin birth, Jesus is the only way, Jesus is God. Those are the sort of things that they would say, yeah, this person sees the world through a biblical worldview. So let's just say 17 is, so 17% of that 80% is what we're seeing. Here's the deal is, and this could give us hope. That 17% has not shifted. It's just the cultural, yeah, I'm a Christian, that has eroded. So there's actually hope here that the percentage of people that are like, I'm sold out to Jesus, the Bible's the authority in my life, I see the world through that lens, that number has not shifted. I want to say that out loud, that number has not shifted. It's the gap in between that and the 80% that has eroded. So that means that cultural Christianity has gone away because it's no longer, and I'll talk about it, it's no longer popular to say I'm a Christian. But here's what it does. Here's a hope in this, is the light shines brighter. The light absolutely shines brighter. I want to close kind of with this thought. I talked about how in kind of the mid-century people went to church and were involved in Christianity because they saw that it was beneficial for society and for individuals, right? This is what we're seeing now. Our world seems hopeless and that it's going downhill. And the perception, and I say it's a perception, the perception is that Christianity and the church has contributed to it. This is one of the big obstacles that we have to get over. I'll give you, these are a couple people, even just in the last couple years. This is Ted Haggard. He was a president of the National Association of Evangelicals. He built a church in his basement, blew up to 14,000 people. And he was caught with a male prostitute buying meth in Denver in 2006. This right here is James, I'll go down. Bill Hybels, and I'll go back up once I remember his name. It's been a long time. I'm friends with his son, actually. This is Bill Hybels, pastor at Willow Creek in Chicago. It came out multiple allegations, including Nancy Ortberg, John Ortberg's wife, of inappropriate misconduct, and he was removed. And then James McDonald, he's a guy who started Harvest Bible in Chicago, and then he started what was called the Vertical Church Movement. Radio shows, all sorts of things. So he was caught on audio threatening to put child pornography on his ex-son-in-law's computer, and then his bodyguard came to the authorities and said he solicited me for a hit. And so that's bigger, but we had some here in Modesto as well. So we had some situations here in Modesto. When I first moved here, my neighbor, I knocked on his door to introduce myself, and he said, "Oh, so you're a minister, huh?" He's like, the first thing he asked, he said, "What do you think of all these weird sexual things that are happening with pastors and priests?" And then he told me his opinion. He doesn't go to church. These are obstacles that we have. Here's another one. These are obstacles that we have, and I want us to sit here because I think that there's a lot that we can contribute and a lot that we can process when it comes to this. Let me tell you one more story, and then I'll get out of here. I taught at a Christian high school, Valley Christian High School. It's in Arizona, the #1 Christian school in Arizona, top 50 in the nation, and fantastic program, right? We had a chapel, and they talked about depression, and they talked about hopelessness, and they talked about hope in hopelessness. And I had a student come up to me right after chapel, and he just, like, you could tell he was all messed up. And he's like, I just want to let you know I'm depressed and I've attempted suicide 2 times. And as I sat down and processed it with him, A lot of it had to do with a sense of hopelessness he had. And it's a perception. I don't, there's stats, there's opinions on where our world is and isn't going based on, whatever media outlet you listen to. But the perception it's hopelessness. And then he told me, based on some of the Christian people that are involved and twisted in some of the things he sees, he says, I don't even know what I believe anymore. And so when I think about this is, we no longer live in a time where people move to a town, they're like, I'm going to go to church, We could tell all the people who live around here, work around here, that we exist all we want. But we're about 2-3 steps farther back than we were 50, 60, 70 years ago in being able to build bridges, and we need to learn how to make those extra steps. Let me read this. Exilic worship communities ask more of us than we may be used to giving. I thought that was interesting because we're used to. I was raised in church. We're used to just being like, we're going to build a building in that area of town. We're going to buy 2 vans, and all of a sudden, first week, people are there, and it's just a growing, vibrant church. I helped plant a church, 75 people, 100 people, 200 people. Now they're 1,500 people, and it moved. But I bet if I were to do that now, it would be more obstacles. We have to come to this reality, and we have to learn how to make those extra couple steps, because we have hope, we have answers, we have the greatest news. It's not just advice, we have the greatest news ever to all mankind. And so I'm going to leave us in that tension to sit in this reality. Next week, we're going to talk about this. And like I said, we're going to talk about some of the practicality in this, and you'll find that some of our practices we're actually in front of the curve. And you'll actually find that that's actually a hopeful thing for us. So any questions? I'll take like 2, and maybe I'll stick around after. I feel like I just kind of dropped a bomb, but was this good? Was it helpful? Okay. Hold on, Pam, and then I'll go with John.
I think it helps us to understand when people say some of the things they say about church, is to look at how it's been sort of desecrated in the public eye.
Yeah.
And I think they need to see in us a love and a caring for each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we all have here. And I hear other people talk about it when they come, is we see a love for each other, and it's through God and through our belief in Him, and wanting people to care about Him and come back.
Absolutely. John had some thoughts.
Yeah, I won't. So, outside person and just here in the cheap seats. So one of the problems that I do notice, and you had a great chart up there talking about the 80% and the 17%.
Uh-huh.
The 17% is knocking the other 60% down. It's taking them out for a ride. Because when we talked about things that are changing in our lives, we talk about technology. And one of the biggest things about technology is we talk about Google and getting on there and playing with the phone, stuff like that. And guess what? There's a lot of those 17% Christians that know how to do that Google stuff and the social media stuff, and they trash every other person on the planet that doesn't have their worldview.
That's good.
And if you don't have their worldview, you are an underling and not worth being there. And if you don't have Jesus in your life, you're just nothing to them. One of the pictures you showed 1950s, Episcopalian, just all these different Christian values. And unfortunately, the first thing I thought of is, those good old days. So my question is this: do you think those other religions were not around then? Do you think they were in the shadows because of the fact that maybe they were just pressured to stay in the shadows? They were outnumbered?
Yeah, so my answer to that, my quick answer just for the sake of time, is because of the 60s, because of postmodernism, because of a lot of things that happened, people actually were drawn to them quicker in probably the 60s and 70s, 80s, some in the 90s, but mostly in like places like Boulder, Santa Cruz, this, that, and the other. I think that people were drawn to them quick, but I absolutely think they existed. Yeah.
The other question is, you gave the great analogy of the Christians that went into Babylon and they blended with society and they took the stand once in a while. Do you think it's only Christians that can do that? And I say that because we have other religions that are doing the same thing in that lesson today in the United States. I'll give you the Muslim religion. Islam is spreading. It has been spreading forever. But the point being is, they'll join here. Do we give them the break of saying, okay, these are the laws of the land, and you can go ahead and practice what you want? That's all part of what we all have here as part of the country. So is the lesson that is given here only applicable to Christianity?
I would say because I wrapped it in a Christian worldview, I would say, and because that's our audience currently, yes. But I would say as it pertains to, and we could get into political theology, and I don't want to here. I would say from a political theology perspective, I think absolutely. But I think that there are laws of the land still that need to restrict certain practices. But we could talk about that after if you'd like to. Yeah. So,
like I said, and as I told my aunt, this is in my head, my wife was telling me, shut up, John. Shut up, John. Don't say it. So if I've offended anybody, say la vie.
Thank you. All right. I'll be around after if you want to chat more, but I know some people probably need to get out. And thank you so much. Let me pray for us. God, I want to echo Isaiah 6. God, we don't know what tomorrow holds, but you're on the throne. You're high and exalted. So God, as we come together, even this Sunday, may we see it as a moment in which we're being formed. We're giving glory to the one who is on the throne so that we're sent out as a people into a world that need you and your message. And we pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you.